kind of feel obliged to do the welcome and introduction, even though technically I'm the guest today, as I will be presenting. But before I do so, first of all, I'd like to welcome everyone for joining us today from wherever you are in the world. As always, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I will actually not steal the spotlight for the introduction, but instead welcoming my friend and colleague, Dr. Paul Clayton, who's kind of going to run the show and the state of affairs for us today before I kind of unleash the information that I'd like to share with everybody today on this occasion, on this pre-Christmas kind of end of final one of 2021 meetings of mine. So Paul, I'll hand over to yourself and then I'll wait for your cue until I kind of bestow what I'd like to share.
Okay, Colin, well, thank you for introducing yourself. I thought I was going to do that, but you jumped in before I could start. I think everybody on the call knows who you are, and you're a published scientist in the area of exercise and health, and you are my counterpart, I think, in the ZinZino team, because I'm all about nutrition, but I touch on exercise, and you're I think primarily focused on exercise, but you border on nutrition as well. So we covered some of these topics a few months ago when you grilled me, but this is a game of two halves. So now it's my chance to pin you in the corner and find out what you have to say. When it comes to exercise and its importance for human health and well-being, I'm absolutely on board with you about that. And I know that, the famous quote from Hippocrates is, "Let your food be your medicine." That is an absolute incorrect idea. He didn't say that at all. What Hippocrates actually said is walking is the best medicine. Not many people know that, but he's on your team rather than on mine. And then he sort of hedged his bets and said, well, okay, maybe I wasn't quite right. Food and exercise work together to produce health. So I think we're sort of following a long way after Hippocrates' footsteps. Now we know that exercise and health are intimately connected. We know that exercise is particularly important in terms of brain health as well as cardiovascular, which I know people focus on a lot. And I hope we'll have time to touch on all of these topics. Why don't we kick off, Colin, by you telling us a little bit about how you feel exercise fits into the overall ZinZino message.
Yeah, and yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, and I totally agree. I think that we do have a coming together and a central area where our interests directly overlap. And I think further to that point you made, I often use the phrase that movement is medicine. Every single aspect of the human system is enhanced when we move the right way. Because of that association through movement, in its most extreme form, we get to a kind of elite sports performance. And a concern that I have is that, and I've functioned and I've worked in that area for way over 2 decades now. The concern I have is that when I look across the board at how people are picking up on the physical activity message and the exercise message, what they see is this notion of, well, sport is the pinnacle, so I should take from that. That's how I should be, and that's what I should do. And what I intend to do in this session is actually recommend some caution in that area. And actually, I'm going to talk through what I see are the most common missteps that people take when they start to consider their diet in the context of their physical activity and particularly their exercise behavior, because I think that is a ripe ground in the modern area to create mismatch. But I think that right through the middle of getting that right is exactly where ZinZino sits. And I'll kind of build to that towards the end of I've got a few slides that I'd like to share to take people through those common missteps. But even before we get there, just to give away the ending before we arrive, is the quality of your diet wholly determines the quality of the outcome of your adaptation to the exercise you participate in. And all too often, people misconstrue, misinterpret the sport, the elite performance, and what it takes to function at that level. And in doing so, undermine not only their own performance, that's second to it, they undermine their own health. And
Yeah.
they also bring about, more often than not, a negative experience, which means they disengage. And
Absolutely.
this becomes a real stumbling block and a problem.
Well, you know how many gym memberships that you get for Christmas presents after the first week of January, they're gone. They never get used again, which is why those introductory offers are so cheap. And the numbers of exercise bicycles and rowing machines in the attics and cellars of the nation are legendary. I am absolutely on board with you about this. I went to a very puritanical school in Edinburgh, and I was versed in the 3 R's, which were running, rugby, and rowing. And that was very much a part of my growing up. So physical exercise has run through my life ever since I can remember. I take your point on board about the dangers of creating this illusion of physical exercise derived from elite sports. It's actually not a good thing. And I've seen, and you have, I'm sure, plenty of people with overuse injuries and other kinds of adverse health outcomes. So let's step back from that and concentrate instead on people who do perhaps a little bit of exercise, but not much, or not particularly physically fit. What are the health implications of a lack of movement, a lack of physical exercise?
Well, I mean, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because just recently, as I'm sure you're aware, Paul, the World Health Organization updated its status with regards to the components that put you at the greatest risk of developing non-communicable diseases, and with regards to your susceptibility to infection. And sedentary behavior moved all the way through the ranks. If this was a pop charts, to take the top position in that matrix. So we know that sedentary behavior, lack of movement, which I always class as being anti-human beings. We are designed to move. We are a migratory species. If we trace our evolution far back enough, we'll see that our success has been based on the fact that we can move effectively. We learned how to do it. And so what we see now in the 21st century is, and I take quite a strong take on this, is we see people who are, for the majority of their time, in a sedentary rested position. Often a lot of modern professions lean that way as well. And then their proactive choice to engage physically in the world around them is less and less and less. And so what do we see through that? We see increased overweight and obesity, which are not passive conditions. I feel obliged to say that every time I mention them. We're seeing the direct impact of this on cardiovascular conditions, pulmonary issues. We see this with regards to, if we are not putting a stress through the skeletal system, through the muscular and skeletal system, then we see depletion. We see bone mineral deficiencies, and we see muscle wasting, premature muscle wasting. So not just the sarcopenia, which is the age-related downregulation of muscle tissue, but we're seeing signs of this in humans who are late 20s, 30s, and 40s.
Absolutely. So, and this is not an individual problem. This is a societal problem now.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, our average levels of physical activity are between maybe 40 and 20% of what they were 4 generations ago. We've been seduced by information technology. We love hacks that make our lives easier. We are genetically programmed to be lazy, but modern technology makes that too easy.
Absolutely. And look at the current global situation. Just statistics just from the UK alone. Throughout these periods of various types of lockdown, we've seen on average sedentary behavior increase by 14 hours per week.
It's appalling. It's appalling. And type 2 diabetes is spinning off of that. Really unexpectedly, we're seeing huge increases in type 1 diabetes as well. Yeah. So this sedentary lifestyle is causing all kinds of immunological dysregulatory problems. It's not just, increased insulin resistance. It's a whole host of problems. And I'm absolutely on board with you. When the WHO put sedentary behavior and it lists us up there together with smoking, sitting is the new smoking. That's right. How do we put this right?
I think there's multiple ways to approach this, and I think a lot of people have their own philosophy. My philosophy on this is that, and this might seem strange, particularly if there's anyone who knows me from my kind of sports background, we have to detach the association, because it's not about becoming good at sport. It's about moving, and moving often. We also, and again, this might surprise some people, we have to change the narrative around what an effective exercise session is. Because believe me, and I am going to share some slides in a minute, it doesn't need to be, in fact, it shouldn't be really tough. It shouldn't make you sore. It shouldn't be something that you feel like you need to survive. Actually, the most effective dosage of physical activity and exercise is where we have low to moderate. So we need to take the opportunity to move more. That's the first thing. So I always call it being a movement opportunist. So if you've got a commute to work, get off the bus or stop early, the tram, the train, and just take a little bit of a walk into your working place.
I absolutely agree. You know, the American Heart Association talked about this 15 years ago, and they discussed what they call the obesogenic environment. And they talked about exactly that, getting off the bus, stop early, which is possible in Europe, not necessarily in America, taking the stairs instead of the lift, leaving your car as far away in the parking lot from the store as you can, rather than getting too close. I absolutely agree with you about that.
That's one of those things, I've got to say, Paul, that's one of those things that drives me mad. People who drive to the gym, to the leisure center, and they want the closest spot to the door, sometimes occupying a spot they're not entitled to, parent and child disability spot, because they want to be close to the door. Then they go in to conduct some exercise, sometimes to sit on a stationary bike, then back in the car, and that drives me mad. Deliberately disadvantage yourself. Go park further away. Give yourself the opportunity to walk. And I love that one. That's another favorite of mine, is don't use the elevator or the lift. You know, use the stairs. See these as opportunities to move. And then when it comes to how you're going to embrace exercise, because I often get asked, what's the best exercise to do? The one you love. And if you don't love it anymore, do a different one, because compliance is key, and it should add joy to your day straight away. That's the key to it.
You're right. I'm with you 100%. Does it have to be movement, though? I mean, I'm now thinking about things like, instead of sitting at the desk, standing at a desk, 100%. Because that's not exactly moving, but you're putting loading on the sensors in the long bones, probably in the knee joints, and that has a raft of effects as well. So maybe it's just that we shouldn't be so sedentary, but that doesn't mean to say we've got to put on our running shoes, does it?
That's absolutely right. In fact, the truth is that we know is it's actually physical activity means more. So we need to have a basis of physical activity, but those little simple in practice, but so profound in outcome, having a standing desk, weight bearing for more of the day. And all of these things, you know, making sure that you dust around the home every day, you get the vacuum cleaner out. This is what we call our NEAT, our non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And these little things, when we start to add them together, increase our overall metabolic output. We increase our energy expenditure for the day. We demand more from the neurological system. We weight bear through the skeletal system and the muscular system, and the rest and heart rate, whilst we're in that standard upright posture, whilst we're just doing those movements, is just ticking away nicely above true rest and heart rate. That makes when we're doing that most days of the week, that makes a huge difference to our overall health. And it's those kind of habits that we need to focus on, and then punctuating our week with meaningful exercise. And meaningful is not overly demanding. We can do that once in a while, but unless my advice always is, unless you're an elite athlete, unless you're likely to get a huge big payout or a medal that really means something, then go easier on yourself, because you're doing it really for your health and for your enjoyment and your life satisfaction and your quality of life and your physical independence as you age. So let's use it all for those great outcomes and not get deluded into the idea that we're going to win something, because that really doesn't matter.
I want to come back to the idea that this is a societal problem rather than something that is to do with individual lack of moral fiber or grit. The last time I looked, sarcopenia is now, as you said, it's listed in the top, I think, 5 causes of death worldwide. If you look for pre-sarcopenic conditions, and you're talking about frailty, which you're not actually sarcopenic, this is now reckoned to affect fully half of the population between, I think, 38 and 58. 58, yeah. And you know, these are healthy, or should be healthy, middle-aged. This is middle-aged, and I've left that a long way behind. I find that shocking. I think it's an indictment of the way that we live. It's an indictment of the way cities are designed and constructed. It's an indictment of the way transportation systems are designed and constructed. We're up against some very complex and interconnected problems which militate against increasing your levels of physical activity. You're talking about, I think, social reform as well, aren't you?
For sure. We need to look at how we design our living spaces. Because for a long time, as you've already hit upon, we've designed these around aesthetics. There's nothing wrong with that. But when we look at how we interact with our living spaces within those suburban, urban, and inner city areas, we need to start to look at how we can prioritize, preserve, and extend those allocations of space that encourage people to move, time over time. And we can see this on kind of the equivalent of a heat map. When you look at those kind of city areas and how there's been an overall reduction of park space. So not only the space itself, but the numbers of spaces have reduced over time. So there's less opportunity for people to engage in an area that's not dominated by traffic. When we look at and this is causing a fury in the UK, cycle lanes and pedestrian lanes. There is such a raw debate over this notion. This should be something that we celebrate, and we should be seeing every opportunity we can to make it so that somebody can have a safe journey that is self-perpetuated. So that if someone wants to cycle, to jog, to walk, to whatever means, to work, to school, that they can do that. Because currently we have a system at large that minimalizes it. And actually, to some extent, people are taking a risk by doing so. And so we do need to look at how we design our spaces as we move forward. And just a final point on this societal change, we need to bring about a change in attitude. And I love sharing this because it's true. So anytime I've been down to Australia and I've been for a run, and this is in Sydney, this is up in Brisbane, anytime I've been for a run, I will see people and they'll go, "Good on you," and encourage you on. "Good on you, mate," like left, right, and center. We have a very different cultural experience in the UK and in various parts of Europe. And you get a bit of a difference across the States, in my experience, where almost you'll be ridiculed for the same behavior and seen as inconvenience. We need that societal mind shift that actually sees somebody who is owning their own health, who's being accountable for themselves, who is trying to live a little bit more each day, and that should be celebrated. That should be seen as an example of good practice, and almost as like community role models. That should be celebrated and not kind of minimalized. Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how you achieve that shift in the way that these things are perceived. Cycle tracks are a cause close to my own heart because I lived for many years in Rotterdam, and Holland is all about cycle paths. In fact, I think in World War I, the Dutch army cycled to the front on bicycles, where they lasted about 24 hours, but that's another story. And it's true that in some environments, it's almost impossible to walk or cycle. I mean, America, the United States is really bad in that respect. I remember being in Dallas once, looking out of my hotel window, and I could see a restaurant, which was probably 200 yards away. And I went downstairs to the lobby and said, "How do I walk there?" Because it was just motorways everywhere. And they said, "Oh, you can't walk, you have to drive." Yeah. And we have created environments which make physical activity very, very difficult. And then you end up going to the gym, and then you end up, if you're not careful, with delayed onset muscle pain and stiffness. And that is a huge counter-incentive. I don't think that's natural. Let's talk about that, if you don't mind, before we come back to your original train of thought. In the wild, animals don't get DOMS.
No, it's true. And interestingly, if you look across the scientific, this always, by the way, in sports science, the DOMS, the delayed onset of muscle soreness debate always causes a heated debate. There is no consensus. We don't fully know. It's not been identified the actual cause of DOMS. And there will be people who'd say, well, we know it's this, and we know it's that, and we don't. Not when you look across the wealth of the evidence. We don't know why it happens. But interestingly, what can be observed consistently, and there is a wealth of research in this area, and this actually comes back to a subject certainly close to your heart and to mine, is that when we see people who are above 8% of their omega-3 index, And when we see the cellular ratio at the levels that we'd like them to be at, one of the key things elite athletes and recreational athletes start to report and experience is less or no muscle soreness related to exercise performance.
Absolutely.
And that's consistent. That's one of the biggest take homes there is around that area in sports performance. There are some other aspects about increased anabolic response, decreased catabolism, but the key one that this consistent across is that when we're at that point, we don't experience it. And that to me really says everything about the status and where we're at with regards to first of all, the importance of that index, what it means at a cellular and a gross physiological level, the reason why the mechanisms that underlie the experience of it are probably partly kind of initiated by the intensity of the exercise, but largely due to the system that's not ready to receive the stimulus. And we know that across the board, it's all about send and receive when it comes to any kind of stimulus. And my feelings right now, and I think this is where interestingly the research is heading, is that we're going to unveil more and more. It's the state of receivership that in the context of this.
I would say that DOMS is entirely unnatural. You know, the idea that in the Serengeti, every morning the antelope wakes up and knows it's got to be faster than the fastest lion, and the lion wakes up and knows that it's got to be faster than the slowest antelope. You can't afford DOMS in that kind of setting. So I would say that DOMS is another epiphenomenon that is very much related to the sad state of the modern diet.
And further to that, it's interesting because I've looked, I don't know of any report of the sensation of DOMS that goes, certainly when you look at the earliest writings that go back to Flavius, which is AD 46, looking at the preparation of athletes and the treatise of health. So these really new documents, almost 2,000 years old, that actually have a real rich tapestry of information with regards to the physical experience and the physiological change. They're even talking about periodization of training and nutrition, and yet there's no mention of the soreness related to exercise. And again, if we go back further, we can talk about animal survival. How would we survive as a species if we had been unable every other day to outmaneuver our predators? So I totally agree. It's an unnatural phenomenon. And what backs that up consistently is that when we see people who are above, preferably towards 10% of that omega-3 index, water is less or non-existent. So we need to spread that as more of the kind of awareness, and that to be the set point as a part of athletic preparation.
I think that if we step back from the athletic stuff for a moment, I think that if you do have DOMS, the worse the DOMS is, it's actually indicative of a more pro-inflammatory state. And that is going to manifest itself down the road in a variety of other pathological conditions. I think that goes together.
Absolutely. And then we have this notion, which is bizarre, because I've spent much of my time within sports performance has been looking at recovery. So recovery methods and how we better adapt and manage athletes in the wake of training and participation. And, the DOMS signal that can be so debilitating. Some people experience DOMS to such an extent that they will say, I couldn't possibly exercise today.
Yeah.
Now, that comes at a cost when you're trying to develop an individual to improve, because every day matters. But also within that actually functions outside of what we understand in the terms of physiological adaptative rates. So in a normal environment, what we should have is the training stimulus. And so long as that's appropriated at the right intensity, then that should send that signal. So we have a level of catabolism that's induced. This prompts that acute pro-inflammatory response. We get the anabolic wave in the wake of that. But really, from an architectural and a sensational point of view, we should be really quite keen and ready, raring to go in approximately 20 hours time. But what we see when we get pronounced DOMS is a person who can barely move sometimes.
Yeah.
There's not a chance they're going to be able to withstand a similar stimulus for 72, even 90 hours. So that actually in itself, if an individual is experiencing that, you've got to first of all look at your nutritional status, in my opinion. But secondly, you have to recognize the stimulus of exercise is way too excessive. That
Yes.
needs to be reined back in.
Now, as far as I know, I mean, I've talked to people who study vestigial groups, and I've talked about the Hadza in Africa and the Tsimane, and there's others. And from what I'm hearing, they don't have DOMS issues at all. Now, bringing that back to the people that we interact with directly, you in the UK and me at the moment in the United States, I think that there's a role for telling people, even before you start a physical education and program, a physical activity program, you should think about priming yourself, getting that 6:3 ratio down to a point where once you do start, you're not going to be demotivated by crippling DOMs.
I think there's a great case to be made for that. I think that's a key part of it, but I also think there's a great case to be made with regards to considering your nutritional status across the board for at least, in the terms of probably a week or two. So you could have this contemplative phase where you're actually doing that kind of nutritional prep, recognizing that you're going to increase your gross metabolic output. You are going to increase the magnitude of strain against the joints and muscles. That comes at a direct cost and a sensation. And that really you want far better control over those inflammatory responses because you're about to engage in a period that triggers them. So knowing that you're going to play off this cycle, you should prepare the cycle first.
Absolutely. But if you're going to use something like balance oil to do that, you're going to need to initiate that program a little bit earlier than that.
It's
absolutely. Going to take you a while.
Yeah.
Now, there are some other things, I think, from the nutritional world that might be useful in terms of prepping. And one of those is something you and I have talked about in the past, and that is gynastemna pentathlon, jiaogulan. This idea that you can take this extract, these damaranes, which switch on AMP kinase, and start to prepare your musculature for exercise before you even go into the gym or set foot on the track. I'm sure you've looked at some of the papers as I have. I've found this to be very useful. What's your take on this?
I have found it really fascinating, and I've been looking at it more closely now than ever before. And just within the past week or so, you sent me across a few papers of things that you've been looking at. I think that the potential for this is emerging, and I think that what the current level of understanding, when we look at the kind of upheld cardiovascular benefits, and then when we start to look at that across a broad range of things, even in terms of glycemic control, and then we start to look at other epigenetic factors that mirror the stimulus and the response rate that we see through certain types of exercise, I think that this is a real step forward as to where our understanding is going with regards to performance nutrition. And that it's fascinating. It's when something like this comes across the board. What I find interesting is that there's a moment that you realize much of our nutritional strategy has been really crude when it comes to sports performance.
Absolutely.
So we've thought to ourselves, how much energy does the activity cost? Make sure that I've got enough, particularly from a glycogen reserve. And then how much do I need to recover? And then for most people, no criticism intended, that is often really simply refined to a kind of protein strategy. And
wildly oversimplistic.
Absolutely. And yet really, really common. So we see that across the board. I think what we have here is a really strong example in case of these broader effects and impacts that nutritional properties have with regards to their place in the sequence of how the body functions when it's more dynamic, and in the recovery aspect, and how we can almost, and I guess this is where it's going, and I'm not as familiar with the literature as you, Paul, so I'm going to say this with some hesitation, but what I'm seeing is this notion of almost dietary, physical and physiological priming, that we can actually start to engage and elicit and trigger systems to be in a better state of readiness for what it is we intend to do as we increase those external.
Absolutely. We're there. We have that technology. We're absolutely there. Could we, I know you have some slides to show, but I wonder, before we get into that, you touched on insulin resistance, and of course that's a massive problem when you consider the numbers of people with type 2 diabetes or what used to be known as preclinical diabetes, metabolic syndrome, whatever you want to call it, which is not only extraordinarily prevalent, but it's also imposing an absolutely huge burden on healthcare systems everywhere. So that's one area where increased physical fitness, increased physical exercise is going to play an important role. Would you like to list the other major categories, health categories, where we know physical exercise is going to make a positive impact, just for the audience?
I mean, wow.
Where to start? Where to start? Okay,
where do you start? Yeah, and where do you start and where do you end? I mean, obviously, I spend a lot of time focused on the type 2 diabetes pandemic, and what we're looking at as we look down the tunnel with regards to pre-diabetes and those increasing numbers. So insulin sensitivity and how that's enhanced and improved through physical activity, regular physical activity and exercise engagement is a given. It's a surefire way to take control of that situation. When we look at the cardiovascular benefits of exercise, it's interesting, and forgive me because I don't want to make light of this situation, but when these recent times fell upon us and the newspapers started to report, look at this really fit person, even they got the virus. The only people who should be surprised by that were people who know nothing about exercise and fitness. That they should be the only people who are surprised, because as we know, the higher intensities you train at, the greater your infection susceptibility is, and you're putting far more stress on the immune system. So
up to a point, because you can interfere there too, or you can modulate that process. And we could talk about the 1,3,1,6 beta glucans and exercising to exhaustion in heated environments. And there's some really interesting data coming out from that. But that's pretty specialized. That's for the elites. And I think as a general case, you're right, but there's exceptions. That's all.
Yeah, and the thing is that people don't realize is that when we deal with the elites, and as an environmental physiologist, they are every aspect of their function and performance in under those conditions is managed, and it's contained and it's fed forward. But when we take a step back and we just look at those people who are making the headlines, and we're looking at the impact that it has as to why you will be susceptible through through these choices that you make. Well, exercise at the right rate really does bolster the immune response. Exercise at the right rate is going to bolster your aerobic and cardiovascular fitness. It's going to increase your overall exercise and therefore physical tolerance and physiological tolerance. It still is. I mean, diet management of weight should be how we just structure our daily life. But exercise management of weight with regards to the proactive epigenetic effect of it is unparalleled. There's not yet something that we can, and I know that there's some unscrupulous people who try, but there's not yet something that you can put in a tin that brings about the same change, because it's all about gaseous exchange. It's all about metabolic factors that alter as we work through different levels of intensity, and therefore how we utilize available energy systems. And I need to emphasize is that we don't need to be up at the upper limits to achieve the maximal benefits of this. And in fact, low to moderate shows to be the ripest ground. And all of these things, when we look at bone mineral density, strength training, and any women, any females who are listening, you should be more focused on strength training than the men, because you're more susceptible to age-related changes with regards to osteoarthritis. And, so it's in your interest to do some type of strength training. But the problem is people think strength training is bodybuilding. It's not. Bodybuilding is right in that sports category again. You don't need to go there to effectively strength train. When we look at our physical independence as we age, that's directly correlated with our quality of life. And our physical independence relies on how intact we are and how well we can move functionally through those kind of strength parameters. So all of this is, and this is just the headline features, folks, all of these are the outcomes of a life that's based on more movement, and a life that really embraces exercise and uses that as a way to meaningfully punctuate our week.
Okay, so you went from exercise to insulin resistance, and you looked at cardiovascular, and that of course has to include cerebrovascular. And if you're able to prevent the progression to diabetes, you're going to reduce the burden of late diabetic complications, which are many and diverse. But could we talk perhaps a little bit more about, I mean, if you're willing to do this, between the links between improved levels of physical exercise and reduced risk of cancer and reduced risks of neurodegenerative disease? Those are areas that are very interesting to me, and I'm wondering whether you'd like to just mention some of the salient, the key points there.
Yeah, I mean that again is a huge area that I function within the UK, particularly when it comes to the impact of exercise on people who are undergoing treatments for cancer, and certainly in the recovery stages of cancer. And this sounds like one of those throwaway statistics, but if we look across the board, and certainly the most recent consensus statement through the British Medical Journal, treatment for cancer is enhanced by anywhere up to 70% if the patient is undergoing a program of structured physical activity and exercise rehabilitation. And there's multiple reasons why, because we see an upregulation of all systems, and the direct consequence and knock-on effect of the immune response as a part of that. When people are undergoing treatment for cancer, then obviously their immune system takes a huge hit. And the right level of physical activity and exercise is a great way to counteract that. But there's a huge nutritional strategy at play as well. But if we look at the preventatives, so let's take a step back a moment. When we look at, and people are often a bit skeptical about preventative health because they see it as the non-measurable aspect, but I think it's perfectly measurable, because it's where we change those statistics around the ever-increasing amount of poor health. But when we look at the impact and why people who exercise frequently and are physically active are less likely to develop certain types of cancer, well, it's all the same, but in reverse. So we see, if we look at what's at the heart and the primary cause of most cancers, whether it's tumor growth or proliferation of the cell, obviously there are genetic factors at play in some, but the top 4 cancers are lifestyle cancers. And that's just a fact. When we look at how many people are affected, and exercise behaviors in themselves counteract a vast majority of what those lifestyle factors will present in the development of cancer. So for that alone, and in a simplified term such as that, exercise counteracting that. But the other thing about exercise, and this is more behavioral now, Paul, is that when we see people who are more aligned to a structured physical activity and exercise regime, then their
other health behaviors come along with that.
That's right, yeah. Their likelihood to reduce those other negative health behaviors.
Less likely to smoke, less likely to eat junk food. This is not a new idea. We started off with Hippocrates, but we don't have to get as far back as that. Have you come across the name Anna Aslan before?
No. Tell me.
Oh, she's a really interesting character. She was a Romanian biologist and a doctor, and she was born at the tail end of the 19th century, and she was around until about the 50s or 60s. And at one point, she was running a clinic in Bucharest, which became very well known. And people were going there from all over the world with cancer. And she had a cancer cure, which involved huge amounts of physical exercise. And she was absolutely excoriated by the medical profession of the day because they didn't understand that there was a link there. But she'd actually seen empirically that this worked. A really interesting physician and scientist, and very underrated in her time. But she was right. I think you'd have to agree with that.
I find that fascinating. And there's a lot in that I share with regards to a mindset. So I've told this story a lot, but I'll tell it one more time because I don't think I've ever spoken about this in a ZinZino audience. The reason why I became so motivated about doing something about cancer was that I remember distinctly being in a school assembly, and this was back in 1979. And this was one of those moments that has lived with me to this day. And the headmaster of our primary school was talking us through this notion of cancer and was explaining to us that cancer affected 1 in 5. And it was important we knew that, because as we grew up, we were likely to meet somebody who had cancer. It was likely that somebody in our family would be affected by cancer, and the cancer was something that we were going to have to deal with. We now live in a world where certainly if you were born after 1960, well, actually cancer rates are now a 1 in 2. 50%. And people are often misled that this is because we have better detection techniques. And that's simply not true. The fact is that more people are developing the condition. And what we need to do is we need to look at, okay, let's take a really sharp and quantifiable, measurable approach towards this. And let's look at what things have changed over that period of time and what we can reverse. And what we do know, and the literature, the research supports this, is that if we get people to think more about what they eat, make better choices, if we get them to include key dietary components on a daily basis, if we get them to move more and we get them to do a little bit of exercise, we can reverse statistics by over 40 years. We could take global society back to 1 in 5. Now, that doesn't eradicate it, and we may have a different opinion on that, but to me, that would be profound enough if we could just get better food choices, have an implementable nutrition strategy that we can embed every single day that makes our nutritional needs easier to achieve, move more, do a little bit of exercise, and the one I forgot, knock out smoking, we can get back to 1 in 5, which would be a huge global medical health wow. It really would. And it's within our grasp. We can do it. It just takes a bit of a call to arm and an action. And the hardest part, which is people need to recognize, they just need to think a little bit differently.
I would say that all the blue zone data is telling us that not only can we drop these morbidity and mortality levels by a factor of 50%, I think we can go further than that. What the data shows us is that we could reduce the burden of chronic degenerative diseases by up to 90%. But the problem is we have allowed ourselves to be shepherded into this really pathogenic society where all of us are getting sicker much more quickly than we used to. Our outcomes are far worse, and we have this pharmaceutical model, which is there to make up for all the poisoning, the chronic poisoning that we experience as a result of the food industry. And the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry, we've talked about this before, are in this death embrace, and we're being crushed in between those two millstones. I think that the COVID may have one positive impact on this particular model because it's become so obvious to us that governments and health professionals, the health associations and the pharmaceutical industry are lying to us. They're profiteering on our backs while we get sicker. The impacts of lockdown have been extraordinarily negative. And the serious safety issues around the vaccines, people are beginning to wake up and they're beginning to realize, I think, what the limitations of the pharmaceutical model are. And if this makes people start to ask more questions and to start to take more interest in promoting their own health through food, better food, through increased levels of activity, the outcomes will be extremely positive. But
on that note, and I think I think there's a lot of things that we agree on, but I think there's certain areas we stand slightly differently on. I do agree that what the world has been through has raised an awareness and an interest in how they can own their own health and how they can really be put in a position of power with regards to the proactivity, the choices they can make. Because what happened with COVID is so many people in the world realized that they were needlessly at risk. And the medical systems recognize that as well. And my state on modern medicine is incredible. If you step outside and you get hit by a car, you need to ring an ambulance. You don't need a supplement, and you don't need
You're talking about acute care, acute medicine, and modern medicine is fantastically good at that. Yes.
Chronic, and this is where we definitely agree.
Yep.
I've got more questions than answers. If we're so good at chronic, why is everything getting worse? And simply because we're not, we just manage this through suppression of symptoms. And that's not good enough, because life is unique. Life is exceptional, and we should treat it accordingly. We should be passionate and driven to live better and not just suppress things that we're tolerating. The best thing ever is to avoid them happening, make better, do more, but also never lose sight of the power of what influence you have on your health status by just making that one better choice each day and build a legacy of success.
Yes.
And that for me genuinely does. It's the reason why I'm here. That for me does start with balance oil. It's so easy. It's that much every day.
Prevention is so much better than treatment.
Absolutely.
And we do have the keys to prevention. And what you're talking about, the things that I talk about, we will, I think, eventually start to make an impact on our appalling public health. Colin, now I know you have, I'd love to talk about the body-mind connection. And we know that physical exercise comes in here through possibly 3, maybe even 4 different routes, all of which are important. But perhaps before we get into that, you said you had some slides to show us. I'm not sure what kinds of slides you have, but is this an appropriate point to?
Why not? I had 3. I wanted to talk people through 3 common missteps. I will try to do so because I'm mindful of time. I'll try and do this in as quick as we might not get through them all, folks, but let's get through some of them. I won't turn it into a full-on. Feel free to interrupt as we go through. But really, this is to either for people yourselves or for people that you work with. I know that a lot of people who tune into these are actually supporting other people through changes. These are the common missteps that I see that are difference between the active population and the elite population. And I'll try not to dwell too long. Okay, so first of all, let me take us into this quick overview. We're going to look at underfueling to facilitate weight loss. There's a common misstep that people make. They think that they're going to use exercise to bring about this calorie deficit along with a change in their diet, and it brings about a compromise in 2 areas. I'm going to show you that now. The second misstep is dietary carte blanche. People think that because I'm exercising, I can eat whatever I want. Simply not true. And then underestimating nutritional quality needs. So let's dive through this. First of all, carbohydrate fuels performance. The more intensely you exercise, the more you need those carbohydrates. So there's a simple process that you can put in place here, which is to say, well, I only ever actually need to reach a certain peak of intensity with regards to my exercise, because I'm not an elite performer. So my carbohydrate needs are less than an elite athlete. However, I do need them, because if I want to maximize and get the most out of my exercise experience and get the best adaptation, then I want to be in the state to take part in that. Now, when the huge low or no carb phase hit, I saw people showing up to the gym who looked like zombies. The problem we have with carbohydrates is twofold. One, people eat the wrong type, simple, refined carbohydrates, nutritionally defunct, aggravating the system with no nutritional contribution. And 2, the fact is people just eat too many carbohydrates anyway. That's why low carb and no carb made sense, because people were having way too much. So the language should be carb appropriation, or be appropriate with your carbohydrates. If we assume that we have done that, and then we look at the intensity that we work out, there's this notion now that there's the fat burning zone when someone wants to burn, like to lose adiposity. This simply isn't true either. And if we have a look at this, this is a good example when the difference between running 10 minutes per mile versus 7 minutes per mile, what we see here is that there's a greater contribution as a percentage from fat, but the overall contribution in total is greater from the higher intensity. We burn more calories, and more importantly, more of those calories come from fat. So when you think about your exercise and what you want from it, fuel accordingly, fuel for what it is you'd like to achieve. But here's a key thing to remember as well. And this comes into what we call EPOC, which is excessive post-exercise oxygen consumption. And this is where we get a longer tail of greater metabolic output in the wake of our exercise. So we have our exercise period. We can match this with regards to our intensity across the chart. And then we get our acute EPOC, and then we get our more prolonged EPOC. And this plays to our advantage because this changes our metabolism in the longer term. So we're burning more energy even at rest. So what we want is we want to hit the sweet spot. We want to be able to fuel our exercise to exercise well. We don't want it to be prolonged. And sometimes the fat burning myth talks about hours and hours of sustained low level tedious activity to burn fat. It simply isn't true. We want to perform moderately for a short period of time, occasionally, to bring about a key outcome. So that's one of the first common missteps, is people start to cut out and create a deficit in their diet where it shouldn't be. It's about being appropriate with those carbohydrates, fueling the performance, maximize on your exercise behavior, and then think about the rest of the quality of your diet. As our exercise demands go on further, actually, we just need carbohydrate more. This further debunks the myth that just going long and slow is going to make you a fat burner machine. It's simply not true. So consider these things when you start to engage, make your exercise meaningful and fuel for the activity that you intend to do. Now, you cannot out-exercise a bad diet, no matter how hard you try, okay? And we're going to go through this simply. 30 minutes of exercise is 2% of your day. So 98% of your day, you're not that. So don't think that that investment is going to come good on everything else. The average exercise session burns around about 300 to 400 kcal. And we see this a lot across social media. Someone's done a park run and then they say, great, I can eat what I want now. And they reach for the chocolate bar. It doesn't matter. It's still going to invoke a systemic inflammatory response. It's still going to bring about all that chaos that comes with refined sugar, and it's going to hit you with 200 to 300 kcal of empty calories, no nutritional benefit. And you're not going to unpack that. There's no switch in the body that says to things like insulin sensitivity and, our kind of responses to glycogen control that says, no, this person's been good. They've been to the gym, so we can't do all that stuff. The body will respond as the body's programmed to respond. You cannot out-train the bad diet. And think of this in the terms of adverse dietary behaviors. So if we just continue to consume a high-fat diet, particularly if it's containing those kind of omega-6s and we're having a lot of kind of saturated fats in there, but this still, regardless of our exercise behavior, will lead us towards metabolic syndrome. Likewise, if because we're exercising, we suddenly dramatically increase our protein consumption beyond our needs, then that itself brings about increased levels of metabolic stress. So we've got to have this really consistent approach towards our diet that is based on moderation, it's based on balance, and it's based on making sure we have those key nutrients available as and when we need them. And this is why quality matters, especially when we're exercising, because all of our exercise behaviors increases our health status so long as we get the rate right. So long as we don't break ourselves, we don't work too intensely too often, we work on low to moderate, we punctuate it with the odd tougher session, what we get is consistent and steady improvements across the board. It galvanizes, makes us a better version of ourselves. But we need to recognize that as we go to those more intense levels, then the infection risk is increased. So lower is better. Most of what you do, and I promise you now, most of 80% of what we do with elite athletes is in that low to moderate stage. And the difference is that when we go to those higher sessions, it's well planned, it's well managed, we care for it in the fallout of it, and we're able to support those athletes back. That's not us. We're just regular people in life doing normal jobs and managing our own health. So we have to bear in mind that there's this critical, what we call the J graph. This works against us if we do too much, too often, too soon. So we want to stay in this level down here, because otherwise we're putting our immunity at risk. And we create what we call the open window. Now in this, Paul, this goes back to what we were discussing before, this open window notion of intense exercise and delayed onset of muscle soreness. These are warning signs. This is a case of that we've done too much too soon. We've overloaded the system excessively, but more importantly, the system probably wasn't primed to deal with it. And certainly having better control of our inflammatory markers and response is a key way to reduce this window and make it so that this window doesn't work against us. That's not achieved purely by taking a macro profile approach, by only looking at carbs, protein, and fats in the wrong way. When we're considering fats with regards to those omega-3s, those polyunsaturated fatty acids, for sure. But all too often, fat, when we macro profile, is just seen as a total, and you can pretty much do what you want. That's a negative way to go. The reason why these micros are important, and this is as simple as I could put it across, is that immune function is driven by it. It's a key essential part of the communications of network of immune control and response. These have to be there in sufficient numbers for that system to communicate and protect us, preserve us, galvanize us, and recover us. If they're not, it simply doesn't happen and the system falls down. Recognizing now that exercise too intensely adds to that stress, and actually that our diet needs to contain these essential microbes anyway on a day-to-day basis, shows just how much priority we need to place on the quality and not simply the quantity of what constitutes our diet. Here are the basics of vitamin E, D, and C. And we can see here how they are implicated within that fundamental response. And again, this is as simple as I can make it. What I want people to recognize is that an exercise diet has to bear in mind that the increased stress increases our need for this and for this system to be supported. And I've blasted through those slides as quickly as I possibly could in the time we had. But our summary is simply this: fuel your performance for the maximum benefits. Exercise is not a punishment or a payment for what you ate. And there's more to nutrition than simply counting those calories. We're 4 minutes off the hour, Paul. Thank you for allowing me to share those slides that I prepared for everybody. Is there any other final questions that you think we've got time to do justice, Paul?
Loads of questions, loads of questions. That open window thing, if you remember this Steve Ovett-Seb Coe rivalry, that open window was absolutely critical in how things worked out between the two of them. But there are a number of hacks, as you say, nutritional hacks, which have allowed us to close that. Now, that is all about elite performance. We're talking, as we've emphasized throughout, about average Joes like you and me and all the rest of the people in ZinZino. We tell people to take more exercise. We're able-bodied, but there's a lot of people, because we're living in such a pathogenic environment. I'm not talking about quadriplegics or hemiplegics. I'm talking about people with arthritis, for example, reduced cardiac output. These are people for whom physical exercise is just a little bit more difficult. What can we do to help them?
You know what? No small movement is too small. The minimum of what you can do is going to create a positive outcome. Mm-hmm. That's all too often, Paul, people focus on the maximums. It's almost like we're hardwired to think this way. And then we think, well, if we can't do that, then what we do is not enough. And that's simply not true. We need to think of it the other way entirely. There is no movement too small. We're looking for the smallest meaningful change. So no matter where you're at, and no matter how little you feel you can do that little and build a track record of success. Be consistent, do that little each and every day. And I promise you, I guarantee you will start to see measurable improvements. And that little will start to become a little bit more as you add time and repetition and consistency to that. And it literally can be something as, and this is really profound and meaningful. When I've worked acutely in big district general hospitals as a clinical physiologist, getting somebody to just lean forward in the chair and start to alter their posture and put a little bit more weight through those lower limb structures, that brings about a positive change. Literally using the table in front of you to draw forward, bringing that posture. All of these things, as tiny as they might seem to some, they are positive movements and steps in the right direction. So always just think, today and now, what's the thing I can do? Do that. And what you'll see is this is a journey, and it's for life. The more we do it, the more we get back.
That's such a positive message to end with. And I think it brings us back to Hippocrates. Food and exercise do absolutely work together to produce health. And I'll just say, he added one or two things to that. He also said, if you're in a bad mood, go for a walk. And if you're still in a bad mood, go for another walk. So, Colin, thank you so much. This has been, fun. I hope that the people listening in have found something there to entertain them or perhaps to interest them. I know a lot of folks have asked questions. I'm sorry we haven't had time to jump in and answer each one of these in turn. I don't know, Mr. Moderator, Thomas, or anyone else who's organizing this, can we keep the line open to answer these questions? But if not, thank you, Colin. We'll meet again. Perhaps we'll have a third match sometime in the new year.
Look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for attending, tuning in and giving your time. Have a great Christmas. All the very best. Thanks, Paul.